This is the video animated version of the Radwa&Radwa podcast, where we aim to communicate scientific research to science enthusiasts. We post 4 versions of each episode, in English and Arabic, and in podcast and YouTube video formats. All the links are in the description below. You will also find our references in the description. We are your hosts, Radwa Ewaisha
and Radwa Sharaf,
PhDs, pharmacists, and molecular biologists.
And in our episode today, we will be discussing one of the most successful stories in the history of science and public health. We'll be talking about a disease that was completely eradicated by mankind, smallpox. Radwa, can you tell us a little bit about smallpox for anyone who doesn't know?
Yeah, so smallpox is an infectious disease that is caused by the variola virus. It is one of the most devastating diseases that humanity has ever known. So when someone gets infected with smallpox, they initially develop fever and vomiting. And over the course of a few days, a characteristic rash starts to develop, characteristic blisters and bumps that are filled with fluid. And then these bumps would then scab and fall off, which leaves extensive scars on survivors of smallpox. It killed about 30% of the people who got infected. So if someone doesn't die of the smallpox infection, many of the survivors suffered extensive scarring and even blindness.
Yeah, unfortunately, the images I've seen for people who were infected with smallpox are quite hard to look at. And 30% is a very high number for mortality. Were there specific regions in the world that were more severely impacted than others?
So smallpox spread to almost all of the world. It is thought to have originated in Northeast Africa, in Egypt. So the earliest evidence was found in Egyptian mummies. And if you visit National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Cairo, you will see that the mummy of King Ramesses V has lesions on the face. So he's thought to have got infected with smallpox and to have died of smallpox. In the 18th century, almost 400,000 Europeans died every year of smallpox, and 1/3 of all cases of blindness were estimated to be due to smallpox. In the last century of the existence of this disease, it has killed 500 million people, which is a huge number.
So, as we said in the beginning, smallpox was eradicated by mankind, but in order to eradicate a disease, we first had to develop a vaccine. And until that point, we didn't have any vaccine. So can you tell us the story about the world's first vaccine?
Yeah, so smallpox vaccine is the world's first vaccine. It's usually attributed to Dr. Edward Jenner, who was a British physician. But then I think it started much earlier than that. So people realized that once someone gets infected with smallpox and recovers, if that person survives, then they never get the disease again. And so the practice of variolation started. So variolation was the practice of introducing material from pustules or blisters of smallpox from an infected person to a healthy person who has never been infected. And so people realize that this makes that healthy person immune to the disease and they never develop smallpox. So the practice of variolation was reported in different places in the world. So in China, in Africa, in India, and there were different ways of doing it. So for example, in China, it was reported that the material from the blisters was ground and then it was blown into the noses of healthy people. But then in other places, that material was scratched into the surface of the skin of a healthy person. So this practice then moved to the Ottoman Empire and from there to Europe. In Britain, many people knew that if you get cowpox, you are immune to smallpox. And cowpox is another virus that is a close relative of smallpox, but its natural host is cows. And because its natural host is not humans, it usually causes mild disease in humans. And many maids who worked with cows would get cowpox because being close to cows, and then they would know that they're immune to smallpox. So the British physician Edward Jenner in 1796, realizing that inoculation with cowpox can make someone immune to smallpox, decided to try an experiment. He took material from the pustules of a maid infected with cowpox and inoculated that into the skin of his gardener's 8-year-old son. Then inoculated the child with smallpox a few weeks later, and he realized that he was immune to smallpox and never developed the full-blown disease. So, of course, cowpox was a much safer option because its natural host is not humans, and thus the first vaccine was introduced by Edward Jenner. And the word vaccination comes from the Latin word vacca, which means cow. And then later, the practice of variolation was banned, and the cowpox vaccine was used instead.
Of course, at the time, the ethical considerations of inoculating a small child with a virus that had a 30% mortality rate wasn't really taken into consideration. But nowadays, scientists are much more aware of these ethical considerations, and ethics committees need to meet in order to discuss if any of the experiments to be conducted violate the rights of the study participants. So just something worth noting here. But of course, it was really helpful to mankind to know that this vaccine can protect against smallpox. And can we move forward a little bit with the story? How was this vaccine used to eradicate the disease?
Yeah, so just a quick comment on what you said. So, because this was a devastating disease, there are many stories of people trying it on other people, especially vulnerable populations. So, there are stories of trying it on children in orphanages, which, of course, now is not acceptable by ethics committees anywhere in universities. But then back to your question about how smallpox was eradicated. So now that we had a vaccine, there were coordinated global efforts to eradicate the disease or fight the disease. So these started as early as the beginning of the 19th century after the vaccine was introduced, and they intensified in the mid-20th century. So there were vaccine mandates by many countries. Everyone had to get vaccinated. There were mass vaccination campaigns going from house to house, and then there were generous vaccine donations to developing countries. And then later, some of these developing countries would manufacture their own vaccines. Disease surveillance was very important. So when cases were detected, they were isolated, and then people living close by were vaccinated. The disease was declared eradicated in May 1980. And the last person to acquire the natural smallpox infection was a 3-year-old girl in Bangladesh named Rahima Banu. But then we finally were able to eradicate the smallpox disease thanks to vaccinations and coordinated global efforts.
Yeah, a wonderful success story indeed. Can you share with us some of the learnings we acquired from the use of a smallpox vaccine to eradicate a disease like this?
Yeah, so we learned that we can actually eradicate many infectious diseases. We don't have to live with these infectious diseases. Through science and through coordinated global efforts, through research and evidence, we can develop vaccines and tools to help us eradicate many other infectious diseases. It's also important to remember history, to remember that we can go back to the days when millions of people would be dying because of an infectious disease if we decide to abandon science, abandon evidence, and adopt misconceptions about the safety and efficacy of vaccinations. So it's important to know where we started, where we're at, and to know that we can eradicate infectious diseases through science.
Thanks, Radwa. So, to summarize what we've learned today, Radwa shared with us a story of how mankind was able to not only develop the first ever vaccine, but also use that vaccine to completely eradicate an infectious disease as fatal as smallpox was and entirely get rid of any potential source of a natural infection in the 1980s. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to our podcast and our YouTube channel. You can also find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Feel free to reach out with suggestions for future episodes or leave us a comment directly on our YouTube video. See you next time!